Hello, everyone, and welcome to Silver Streams, the weekly podcast from the AFI Silver Theater and Cultural Center's programming team. I'm Todd Hitchcock, AFI Silver's Director of Programming.
I'm Abby Algar, Associate Film Programmer.
And I'm Ben Delgado, the Assistant Film Programmer.
And today we're going to discuss the latest offerings in AFI Silver's virtual screening room, as well as recommending some other titles to view at home.
So we have 6 new films in the virtual screening room this week, and these are Days of the Bagnold Summer, which is a sweet coming-of-age story about single motherhood and Metallica, set during the Great British Summertime and based on the critically acclaimed graphic novel by Joff Winterhart. We have the documentary 17 Blocks, which follows 4 generations of one Washington, D.C. family over the course of 2 decades. We have Sin, from Russian director Andrei Konchalovsky of Dear Comrades fame. And this is a drama about Italian Renaissance artist Michelangelo undertaking 2 commissions for rival families in 16th century Florence. We have Test Pattern, which is part psychological horror, part realist drama set against the backdrop of national discussions around inequitable healthcare and policing, the Me Too movement and race in America, and it stars DC-raised actress Brittany S. Hall. We have Twilight's Kiss, a very touching, heartfelt drama about 2 closeted men in Hong Kong who strike up a romance in their golden years. And lastly, but not leastly, we have a new 2K restoration of the unrated director's cut of French filmmaker Olivier Assayas's 2002 postmodern neo-noir thriller, Demonlover.
This week, we're going to discuss all of the new films premiering this week in AFI Silver's virtual screening room, and also briefly recap some of our most popular titles that opened in previous weeks and are also currently available to screen there. We have a few special announcements about upcoming festivals and events to share with you. And then finally, we'll close with our Programmer's Pick section, where we discuss other ideas for films to watch at home. This is episode 37 of Silver Streams. We began this podcast in April of 2020, shortly after closing the doors to the AFI Silver Theater and launching our virtual cinema program. And we'd like to thank everyone out there who has listened to the podcast during this time. Some of our recent episodes have proven to be among our most popular, including last week's episode 36, where we discussed Martin Scorsese's classic Taxi Driver, which recently marked its 45th anniversary. Or several weeks back, episode 27, where we discussed F.W. Murnau's 1922 silent vampire classic Nosferatu, and also interviewed silent film accompanist Andrew Simpson. Thank you all for listening to Silver Streams, and also a big thank you to everyone out there who has been screening films at home from our virtual screening room. By screening these films at home, you are supporting AFI Silver. We receive a portion of the proceeds for every virtual cinema transaction that you make. So by screening at home this way, you are supporting our theater during our extended physical closure. Thank you all for supporting the Silver during these challenging times. And a reminder, you can find all of the titles that we are currently offering to screen at home on our website at afi.com/silver. And if you ever have any feedback or questions, you can email us at silverinfo@afi.com.
You can find the podcast each Friday posted on our website at afi.com/silver, in our Friday e-blast, and on our social media channels. And we're in all the places that you usually find your podcasts.
And thanks as always to our new subscribers and new listeners. Welcome if you're new to the show. If you are listening to the show for the first time or have listened for the past few weeks, you've heard me say to push the subscribe button in your app of choice. So please be sure to do that, and please be sure to rate it while you're at it, and give us a few comments on your app of choice as well. That really helps the show get in front of people who may not know it. And of course, recommend the show to friends, family, anyone who you think may have an interest in Silver Streams. And a big thanks, as always, to everyone who went over to our virtual screening room and watched a film or 2 or even 3 this past weekend. Our big hit was the excellent Oscar frontrunner Minari from director Lee Isaac Chung. That is a semi-autobiographical look at his life growing up on a farm with immigrant parents trying their best to live the American dream. This Korean-American story is full of heart, it's beautiful and emotionally resonant. If you haven't already got a chance to watch it, I highly recommend visiting our website to book a ticket for it now, as we have some added show times to announce. The limited virtual engagement runs through Thursday, February 25th, and there are both 4 and 9 o'clock screenings each day on Saturday and Sunday. That's February 20th and 21st, and 9 o'clock screenings for all other days. You'll have 4 hours from the start time to start watching the film and 4 hours to finish once you press play. And your rental also includes an exclusive Q&A with cast and crew that plays immediately following the film. And another Oscar hopeful, Dear Comrades, is also among our top performers for the third week in a row. This historical drama is the latest from director Andrei Konchalovsky, and it depicts a strike by the workers of the small industrial town of Novocherkassk in response to the communist government raising food prices in 1962, and shows the ensuing massacre seen through the eyes of a devout party activist. And if you're one of the many who has already watched this one, we have more Konchalovsky for you this week, as Abby mentioned at the top of the show, with the film Sin in 2019 that he also directed. And like Minari, Dear Comrades is followed up immediately by a cast and crew Q&A, this one with the director and the film star.
Well, also among the top performing films again this past weekend was the documentary MC Escher, Journey to Infinity, which is the new film about the world famous Dutch graphic artist, MC Escher, of the title. It's narrated by British actor Stephen Fry. So, that's a winner right there. Escher was active as a graphic artist from the 1920s onwards, but was really only recognized very late in his career. And then again, when his work had a resurgence of popularity in the 60s and 70s. And even if you've never heard of Escher, as I mentioned last week, you've definitely seen his work, and his work has really pervaded popular culture since the 1960s. But despite this popularity and despite the popularity of the work, MC Escher has always been quite a mysterious figure, and that's something that this film is looking to change. It has interviews with 2 of the artist's sons, and it's really an in-depth look at his legacy and why his work has endured in the way it has. And also doing well is the breakout indie sci-fi satire Lapsis, which is a nominee for the Best First Screenplay Award at this year's Independent Spirit Awards. It's written and directed by filmmaker Noah Hutton. And yes, it's a sci-fi film, but as I said last week, it's kind of a lo-fi sci-fi film. In that it's set in a reality very much like our own. The technological advances and the kind of societal structure that we see in the film would easily fit right in 2021. There are no aliens, there's no special CGI effects. And the film is really less about fetishizing technological and scientific advances and more about looking at how these things contribute to and accentuate and reveal class and economic inequalities. At its core, Lapsis is about this gig worker who gets an in-demand job laying cables which support the quantum computing revolution that has taken off in this alternate version of our world in the film, only to find himself pulled into a conspiracy involving other hostile cablers or workers, corporate corruption, and his mysterious predecessor on the job. So there's comedy, satire, social commentary, sci-fi, and robots. So it's the whole package.
Also among the top performers in our virtual screening room right now is the film Two of Us, which is Filippo Meneghetti's award-winning drama about 2 long-term romantic partners, played by Barbara Sukova and Martine Chevalier, who have remained closeted about their relationship status for decades. And this film is France's Oscar selection for the Best International Film category this year. Also, Another Round, starring Mads Mikkelsen, which is the latest film from Thomas Vinterberg, a dramedy about a group of middle-aged high school teachers in Copenhagen who experiment with daytime drinking, somewhat disastrously. And this film is Denmark's Oscar selection for the Best International Film category this year. We also have Leona, about a young Jewish woman in Mexico City who finds herself torn between her strict family and her forbidden love for a non-Jewish man. And then a number of excellent documentaries, including Coup 53, an expose on the 1953 CIA and MI6 engineered coup in Iran from filmmaker Taghi Amirani and co-producer and editor Walter Murch, along with a memorable cameo appearance by actor Ralph Fiennes. Also, Heart-Worn Highways, a new restoration of James Zalapski's 1976 outlaw country documentary, featuring music performances by, among others, Townes Van Zandt, David Allan Coe, Steve Earle, Rodney Kroll, and Guy Clark. Some Kind of Heaven, Lance Oppenheim's surreal expose on life in the Villages, a mega retirement community in Florida. Also, A Casa, My Home, a documentary about a squatter family living on the wild outskirts of Bucharest in Romania, which we previously featured in our EU film showcase. And finally, My Rembrandt, about the art market and very high-end old master collecting, which makes a nice bookend with our other Dutch art world documentary right now, the MC Escher documentary.
And in addition to everything going on in the virtual screening room right now, we are also getting very close to opening our next virtual festival, the Capital Irish Film Festival, which will be presenting March 4th through 14th with our partners at Solus Nua. We've announced now the lineup of 14 feature films, 11 short films, and 2 music events. Our opening selection is Ireland's 2021 Oscar submission, Aracht, which is a period piece set during the Great Famine of the 1840s, and it's made entirely in the Irish language. We have a documentary about Thin Lizzy frontman Phil Lynott. We have an Irish vampire comedy called Boys from County Hell. We have a whole section spotlighting the work of animation studio Cartoon Saloon, which includes their latest film, Wolfwalkers, accompanied by a conversation with directors Tom Moore and Ross Stewart. And we also have our closing selection, which is a new film called Here Are the Young Men, starring, among others, Anya Taylor-Joy, who's the breakout star of The Queen's Gambit and Emma and The Witch. And in addition to the conversation with Cartoon Saloon's Tom Moore and Ross Stewart, which I mentioned, we have a bunch of other filmmaker Q&As to look forward to. We have also a program of new Irish hip hop and R&B music videos, which was put together by the Dublin International Film Festival, and also a recorded concert by the Irish 4-part harmony group Landless, which is being produced for International Women's Day on March 8th. So there's lots to enjoy, and it's just $100 for access to everything in the lineup. So if you are planning to check out a few of the films or the programs, and you should be planning to do that, it's a great way to save some money with a pass, and then see a bunch of great films and programs that you really won't see anywhere else.
And before you head to our Capital Irish Film Festival virtually, of course, you can check out MLK FBI starting Friday, February 26th. We have a special limited engagement of the new documentary, which we discussed in depth a few weeks back on episode 34, where we talked about MLK on film. This is the latest documentary from the great Sam Pollard and uses newly declassified files and revelatory restored footage to tell the story of Martin Luther King Jr.'s harassment at the hands of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. It's a story we've heard about for decades, but this is really the first time a documentary has uncovered just how deep and extensive this targeted harassment was. This is a special limited engagement running from February 26th through the 28th with a limited number of tickets. All tickets are pay what you can, and the special engagement also includes an exclusive recorded Q&A with the director, Sam Pollard, moderated by CBS News political analyst Jamal Simmons. As I said, tickets are limited and going fast for this one, so get yours if you haven't already. It's MLK FBI, a limited engagement from February 26th through the 28th.
And we also want to announce our next free online silent film presentation, which will be a selection of Charlie Chaplin's Mutual comedies with live musical accompaniment by Ben Modell. And this is going to take place on Thursday, March 11 at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Ben Modell is, of course, one of the preeminent silent film musicians in the U.S. He's played the silver many times in the past and played for us online most recently with The Mark of Zorro last fall. And then Charlie Chaplin is, of course, Charlie Chaplin, one of the great screen comics of all time. And in the period of time before he began making his feature films, and the main mode for silent comedians to put their work out there was in the short format, he spent time with this long gone now company called the Mutual Film Company. And he had a huge contract, very record-setting money involved, payment involved at the time, made headlines for that reason. But over the couple of years' time that he spent with Mutual, he made what are nowadays considered among his very best comedy shorts. So this program is going to include 3 of the films from that era in Chaplin's career. The program is going to include The Pawn Shop, The Cure, and The Adventurer. In order to watch the live stream of the screening and performance, and again, this is going to take place Thursday, March 11 at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So please mark your calendars for that one. And in the meantime, please be sure to check out Ben Modell's YouTube page, which has an archive of his work playing for a variety of silent films, including his silent comedy Watch Party, which takes place as a live stream every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern, new episodes every week. And then the archive of past episodes is there on Ben's YouTube page. And that would be a great way to get familiar with his work and get ready for the performance he's going to do with us Thursday, March 11. And then I also want to mention to everyone out there to also be on the lookout for our new African Film Festival. This is one of our biggest annual film festivals each year. It's usually held in March. This year, it's going to be taking place online in April. So save the date for this one, April 1 through 18, the 2021 edition of the new African Film Festival. Stay tuned for more details on that soon. Okay, so that's what's coming up for special events. Here are the new films debuting in the virtual screening room this week.
So first up is the British comedy Days of the Bagnold Summer, which is coming to us from Greenwich Entertainment. And I'm really glad we get to start off with this film because it is a very sweet and lovely breath of fresh air that will take you away from all the worries of the world for about 90 minutes. But it'll also make you genuinely care about its central characters, a lonely single mum and her equally lonely teen son. And it will leave you perhaps with a tear or two in your eye, both from laughing and from crying too. Days of the Bagnold Summer is the feature debut of British actor turned director Simon Bird, who is best known for his role as Will on the British comedy series The In-Betweeners. And I know Ben and I talk a lot about Peep Show on the podcast, but I have to say that The In-Betweeners comes a very close second for me in terms of all-time favorite comedies. So needless to say, I was very excited to hear that Simon Bird had directed a feature film. He did have a previous short that he directed, the 2016 film Ernestine and Kit, which definitely showed the kind of mixture of dark comedy and weirdness and irreverence that I appreciate. So I was ready for good things with this film. And I have to say, Bagnold Summer doesn't disappoint. In fact, it's not just darkly funny, it's also really, really surprisingly sweet and touching. The film is based on the critically acclaimed graphic novel by British writer and artist Joff Winterhart. And it's essentially a very sweet coming-of-age story about the Bagnold family, the single mum, as I mentioned, Sue, played by Monica Dolan. She's a shy librarian. And then her teenage son, Daniel, played by Earl Cave, who just happens to be obsessed with Metallica and with not hanging out with his mum. So the film takes place over the course of one long, not that hot summer, because this is England, which Daniel was supposed to spend with his dad and his dad's new wife in Florida, but which turns into 6 endless weeks stuck at home with his mum after his dad abruptly cancels the trip. And Daniel is devastated not to be going to Florida, which in the British imagination, or at least as I remember it in my imagination growing up, kind of represents this ultimate, slightly out of reach, exotic holiday destination where everyone has a pool and spends all day on the beach or at Disney World drinking endless cans of soda. And besides not getting to see his dad and not getting to go to Florida, Daniel is even more devastated that he's facing 6 weeks of hanging out with his deeply uncool mum. All he wants to do is listen to heavy metal and start his own band. All Sue wants to do, his mum, is spend time with Daniel and relive some of the fun times they used to have together when Daniel was a younger kid. So needless to say, there's some conflict between this odd couple. And in the end, the film is kind of a coming of age tale for both of them, as Daniel learns to appreciate his mom a bit more and Sue learns to let go and in various ways take control of her life and stand up for herself. And it's kind of rare that you see a coming of age tale like this that focuses equally on the parent or parents and child in the situation, and that really allows each to be fully rounded, empathetic characters in their own right. This relationship does feel very real. It's also hilarious, and at times it's very poignant. Monica Delan is incredible as Sue, this hardworking, outwardly shy, but kind of inwardly possessing this strength that perhaps she doesn't even know she has. Monica Dolan has had a long career as a character actor in British film and TV. You might have seen her recently in A Very English Scandal opposite Hugh Grant, or actually in this year's The Dig with Carey Mulligan and Ralph Fiennes and Lily James and Johnny Flynn. And she really does knock it out of the park with this role here. And then Earl Cave, son of musician Nick Cave, is also absolutely excellent here as this greasy-haired, music-obsessed teen. He was most recently seen in The True History of the Kelly Gang. And I think based on his performance there and in this film, it's safe to say he has a long career ahead of him. The supporting cast is also fantastic, with Rob Brydon as Sue's smarmy potential romantic interest, Tasmin Gregg as Daniel's best friend's mum, and Alice Lowe as Sue's sister and confidant. So tonally and visually and compositionally, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that this film has something of a Wes Anderson feel to it, with some awkward English sensibility thrown in. And it also reminds me of another feature debut of an actor turned director that I'm a fan of, 2010's Submarine by Richard Ayoade. The film also boasts a soundtrack by Belle and Sebastian, which mixes in some of their classic songs with some covers and then some brand new songs, which they wrote specifically for this film. And this just adds to the bittersweetness of the film and its characters. And it's also another dash of comic genius, I think, to have a film that's ostensibly about a teen boy's love of Metallica and heavy metal set to a soundtrack of Belle and Sebastian, perhaps the polar opposite of the image that Daniel is trying to cultivate for himself. But ironically, it is actually truer to his experience as a lonely teen looking for validation and meaning in life than maybe some of his heavy metal tracks that he likes. So yeah, if you're a fan of awkward British comedy, if you're a fan of Belle and Sebastian, or a fan of Simon Bird's acting work, or any of the wonderful actors here, I definitely recommend giving this one a try.
Well, Abby, could I start off by raising my hand as a Belle and Sebastian fan? You know, I'm okay with Metallica as well, actually, but Belle and Sebastian has been a pretty big band for me historically, and I was already aware I was a little behind on keeping up with certain things music related, but I'm ashamed to say I do not already have the soundtrack for this, but I will be rectifying that soon. So for me, that's a selling point for catching up and seeing this movie. But I just want to quickly point out that Belle and Sebastian's soundtrack work, not counting other movies that have maybe included a Belle and Sebastian track on the soundtrack. But a few years back, Stuart Murdoch, the singer and lead songwriter in the band, had his own directorial debut with a score by him, God Help the Girl, which we also showed at AFI Silver. And then perhaps some of our listeners will recall further back, 10, 12 years ago, Belle and Sebastian did the soundtrack for Todd Solondz's film Storytelling, which I was quite a fan of, both the film and the soundtrack. So very much looking forward to getting caught up with their work here.
Yeah, I think you're definitely going to enjoy it. Some of the covers they do are also kind of fun here. And yeah, I had no idea that they were even doing this. So I'm obviously quite behind on my Belle and Sebastian knowledge as well. But here you go. It's out there as a studio album. I think I don't even know what number it is now, probably like 50. But they've made quite a few albums. But yeah, it's out there. So you should definitely check the film out and then maybe get yourself a copy of the album. And I think I have a tote bag and a pin from God Help the Girl from 2014 that I proudly have somewhere in my house.
Exactly.
I wish there was a tote bag for this film. It would be really good.
Maybe there will be eventually.
And I think we're all big Belle and Sebastian fans, and I'll count myself as a Metallica fan as well, but also a Simon Bird fan. I know Abby and I have discussed this off pod, but I'm also a pretty big In-Betweeners fan myself, so that's an in for me. And as you were going along, I had in the back of my head the film that you mentioned in comparison, Submarine. So once you said that, I'm totally on board. So I'm looking forward to catching up with this one as well.
Yeah, I think you'll enjoy it. And of course, Simon Bird, having played an adolescent teen character undergoing his own struggles in The In-Betweeners, I think, he was primed to do a really good job in directing Elle Cave here. And Elle Cave, in fact, gives a great performance. So yeah, highly recommend it. So again, that is Days of the Bagnold Summer, coming to us from Greenwich Entertainment.
And up next in the virtual screening room, we have a documentary that takes a look at the harrowing and resilient journey of a Washington, D.C. family living just 17 blocks behind the U.S. Capitol. And that is, in fact, where the name of the film comes from, 17 blocks. This documentary from director Davey Rothbart, which we screened at the Silver as part of the AFI Docs Festival back in 2019, takes place over nearly 2 decades using intimate home video footage and interviews to tell a story of the Sanford Durant family, as we see generations struggling with addiction and gun violence through some truly deep lows and some richly deserved highs. Back in 1999, Rothbart befriended Emmanuel Sanford Durant and his brother Smurf when he saw them playing a pickup basketball game in their neighborhood. After their friendship developed, he gave the 9-year-old Emmanuel a camera since he was so interested in Rothbart's own camera. And once he had that camera, he was hooked and he was filming his family, going on to document their daily lives for the next 19 years, capturing everything from birthdays to school dances to family meals to Emmanuel and his brother just hanging out. But mixed in with this quotidian footage, there's some truly heartbreaking and visceral moments of violence and loss throughout the documentary. And as the film goes on, we get to know the family pretty intimately over the course of 85 minutes. Cheryl, the matriarch, battling with addiction. Smurf, the brother, dealing and caught up in a life of violence. Denise, the sister who had to assume a motherly role at a young age, not just of her younger family members, but also becoming a teenage mother herself. And Emmanuel, who kept his head down, staying away from drugs and alcohol, with aspirations to become a firefighter. Through this very personal and raw story that is at times really tough to watch, we see an all too familiar narrative play out in Black America that reflects an ongoing national crisis. The doc never pulls any punches along the way, and it doesn't sugarcoat the people in front of the camera. It doesn't sugarcoat its subjects in any way. But it's always grounded in the family's humanity and their really deep resilience. The film ends with a dedication to DC homicide victims who lost their lives over the past decade since the family's own tragedy in 2009. And we get a sobering full 60 seconds of names written in tiny font across 6.5 screens before we come back to some of the joyful footage of the kids just being kids. Early stuff from the late 90s and early 2000s. And that plays alongside the credits, which open with a credit of collaboration for Cheryl, Smurf, Denise, Emmanuel, and Justin, who at just 9 years old has taken up the camera and just like his uncle did, just like his uncle Emmanuel did back almost 20 years ago. This is a really powerful documentary, and I didn't want to give away too much of the narrative here. As much as there is a narrative, it's more of a verite film, but there are just certain events that are shocking and really should be viewed within the context of the film. But the documentary itself is really not to be missed. Like I said, a tough watch at times, but a really, really good documentary. And for those in the DC area, you'll also recognize some of the landmarks here, some of the neighborhoods. So I I saw that along the way as well, but highly recommended for me if you want to watch this great documentary. Almost like a boyhood film that takes place over a very long period of time, 20 years here in this case.
So, Ben, some of our listeners might possibly recall when this film first debuted on the festival circuit was actually back in 2019. That's the summer that it played as part of AFI Docs at the Silver Theater. And here we are all the way out in 2021, and the film's getting distribution. In our case, as virtual cinema, and that's quite a long stretch between festival premiere and an actual distribution. Of course, many films have a good run on the festival circuit and never have meaningful theatrical distribution. So it's on the plus side that it's getting distribution. But why did it take so long? Well, not sure how to exactly explain that other than to say it's ultimately a great story in that it found a terrific distributor with MTV Documentary Films, who were only created a couple years ago as a subset of the larger MTV entity. And they've been off to a fantastic start since they began releasing films just a few months ago, including several that we've featured in the virtual screening room these past few months. Films like 76 Days, which has been a big hit for us in the virtual screening room, and which is making its way through the awards consideration process and the Oscar documentary shortlist. Also Finding Ying Ying and Beautiful Something Left Behind. So they've really been on a terrific roll with their releases, leading up to bringing 17 Blocks out to a wider audience.
Yeah, this is one of those sort of winding journeys for a film on the festival circuit that, like you said, I think has ended up in a good home with MTV Documentary Films. 76 Days looks poised as one of the front runners for the Oscar, and this one's also getting good notices, good reviews, as it should. Washington Post gave it 4 stars just in a recent write-up. So happy to see it being released now and found a good home in MTV Documentary Films.
And I think it's really interesting, especially for those of us who live in DC or in the DC area, to see this depiction of Washington, D.C. That goes beyond kind of the political context in which we normally see it in the news coverage, of course, and also in film and TV too. So I think this is sounds like a really nuanced and interesting look at the city and the people who actually live here. And, this is a story that's playing out 17 blocks away from the Capitol and away from, the events that we saw on January 6th during the storming of the Capitol. So, DC is a real place, and it has stories like these.
Yeah, this is certainly a reminder for those who don't live here that there's, real people living in tough times and also not, but obviously this is a depiction of a mostly struggling family here. But yeah, it really does show a different side of DC that we don't normally see. And like I said, I recognized in some of the streets just from living in the area for the past few years myself. So it's another look at what some people may not get to see often, and taking over 1,000 hours of footage, I think, is what we see in the opening credits, cut down here by editor Jennifer Teixeira, who also co-wrote the film with director Rothbart. And it's really something to behold. Hopefully people get a chance to see this great documentary in the virtual screening room and see a side of DC that you don't normally get to see, and a family that's really get to know well and get to love in the film 17 Blocks. Again, that's coming to us from our friends at MTV Documentary Films.
Okay, so next up in the virtual screening room this week is the film Sin, aka Il Peccato, from director Andrei Konchalovsky. That's right, the Russian director of the excellent Dear Comrades, one of my favorites from 2020 and currently one of our top draws in the virtual screening room, also is the director of this Italian-made film. And Sin, actually premiered back in 2019, so it predates the Dear Comrades shoot and release, but in the somewhat desultory way that international films sometimes make their way to the US, not to mention the additional challenges of the global pandemic. These two films have arrived in reverse order from that in which they were made here in 2021. Konchalovsky has had a one-of-a-kind filmmaking career, one that has combined both faithful adaptations of Chekhov and the Soviet Union back in the 60s and 70s, and then action movies starring Sylvester Stallone in 1980s Hollywood. But the first thing to remind everyone here about in connection to Sin, a somewhat unconventional biopic of the Italian Renaissance artist Michelangelo, is that Konchalovsky was the co-screenwriter of one of the greatest ever artist biopics, actually one of the greatest films in film history, full stop, that being Andrei Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev from 1966. So yes, the now 83-year-old Andrei Konchalovsky has been at this filmmaking thing for quite a long time. And I expect that at least some of our listeners may recall the pretty well-known Michelangelo biopic, The Agony and the Ecstasy from 1965 with Charlton Heston in the title role, directed by Carol Reed. But unlike a latter period artist like, say, Vincent van Gogh, for whom we could do an entire series of pretty good biopics, we haven't yet seen the life of Michelangelo explored on screen multiple times. And the time period that Konchalovsky chooses to focus on here in Sin begins shortly after Michelangelo completes work on the Sistine Chapel in Rome, and then begins work on what will eventually be the monumental tomb vault of his patron, Pope Julius II. But this moment in time is during the time of the Italian Wars and warring popes and rival dynasties, with Julius's Della Rovere family in opposition to the Medicis and their guy, Pope Leo X, who eventually supplanted Julius. And the Medicis, to whom Michelangelo had long ties predating his work with the Della Roveres, tempt Michelangelo into taking on their pet project, designing new facades for the San Lorenzo Basilica in Florence, even though he has an exclusive contract for his current major project and isn't supposed to take on any side work, let alone something so monumental for the rival Medicis. All of this may make Michelangelo sound like some kind of wheeler-dealer and greedy two-timer, and his frustrated patrons do occasionally make that accusation. But the character of Michelangelo conceived here by Konchalovsky and his co-screenwriter Elena Kiseleva is better understood as simply unconventional, with an obsessive mind and a compulsive yen to create, single-mindedly focused on the realization of the greatest of artworks, with the niceties of society, creature comforts, and manners all secondary and to be damned. He's also a little dour and devout, if perhaps in a self-styled sort of way. And the Italian actor Alberto Testone does an excellent job portraying this singular personality on screen. We see almost no scenes of Michelangelo handling brushes or sculpting tools. The film focuses almost exclusively on the medieval world around Michelangelo, a vision of a filthy and sinful world with danger and debauchery ever present, and the wants and the desires of the ever-warring nobility and the church dictating what happens for everyone else. And overall, the location work and production design in Sin evoke this era really quite well. One of the best segments in the film comes when Michelangelo vacates the papal palaces and dirty streets of Rome and Florence for the magnificent mountains of Carrara to oversee the quarrying of the marble for the Pope Julius vault. And these scenes on the mountainside where the marble is cut out from, and in the village amongst the stoneworkers, is a very different world from Rome and Florence, where Michelangelo pursues his trade, and one in which the artist actually seems happier in and inspired by. This segment also includes the unearthing and transporting of a trailer-sized chunk of marble selected by Michelangelo, nicknamed the Monster, which looks fully convincing on screen and which multiple viewers have pointed out recalls, in a positive way, the hauling of the steamship over the mountain in Werner Herzog's Fitzcarraldo from 1982. Michelangelo ultimately spends several years on his Carrara adventures and, yes, encounters further financial intrigues here, and it's almost like a movie within a movie in this quirky epic. I'd recommend watching Sin on its own merits, but coming as it does hot on the heels of Konchalovsky's career masterpiece, Dear Comrades, I'd suggest that both films belong on the must-watch list right now. Just not as a double feature, because Sin is a bit on the long side, so make it 2 separate nights to enjoy Konchalovsky's excellent late career filmmaking.
Yeah, as we mentioned a couple times already, Todd, this is the second Konchalovsky film we have in our virtual screening room, and I was surprised to see it announced after Dear Comrades, but I'm excited to see both of them. I still haven't seen Dear Comrades yet, but this one especially, now that you've pointed out that he was a co-writer on Andrei Rublev, that seems so hard to fathom, given that it's 2021 and Andrei Rublev came out quite a while ago. So looks like he's been doing good work for many years now.
Yeah, I mean, as I pointed out, it's such an unusual career, being that he started out making films in the Soviet Union, and then he had a sojourn in Hollywood in the 80s, which did include some artsier titles, but ultimately some very commercial titles. There's a lot of time off in between along the way as well, and some unusual projects, including a television adaptation for NBC of The Odyssey. I think that was still in the 80s. Maybe that was the 90s. And honestly had maybe kind of been forgotten about a little bit in later years. And then here he is in these last few years with, in the case of Dear Comrades, many people are saying this may be his best film ever. And even though the distribution of his last few films has been spotty, his last several titles have been premiered at the Venice Film Festival. And he's had multiple titles selected to be the Russian submission for the foreign language or best international film category from the Oscars. So he hasn't completely gone away. But be that as it may, here we are in 2021, and we're getting his last 2 films arriving back to back, overlapping at the same time. And it's pretty wonderful that that's the case. And again, I highly recommend both, 2 very different films, to be sure. But I heartily recommend both to our viewers out there.
And then, since you probably can't do a double feature of those 2, because obviously this one is pretty long, I'll suggest a double feature you could do, or maybe a triple feature. I think this would probably make a really good pairing, either with the MC Escher documentary or with My Rembrandt, even.
Yeah, I mean, whether you choose to actually watch them back to back or spread it out, I would absolutely recommend, if your way in has to do with art history, all 3 of those titles. How could you not? I personally do have kind of a soft spot for biopics as a genre, and artist biopics very much so. And I wasn't that wasn't idle talk about the Van Gogh series. That could actually happen someday. There are a lot of good Van Gogh films, but Michelangelo, the point I was trying to make, hasn't been overdone on screen. And whether or not you've seen the agony and the ecstasy or care to, that doesn't matter. The version of Michelangelo's life that Konchalovsky is telling, the really terrific performance by a young-ish Italian actor I have not seen before, Alberto Testone, as Michelangelo here. It's really a terrific telling of the life story. And again, so the way that it goes into fascinating detail about the politics and everything required for the hustle of the work is to me was really fascinating, and that being a way in to paint a wider picture of life in the Middle Ages and Renaissance period in Italy. All right, that's Sin from director Andrei Konchalovsky, and that film is coming to us from Corinth Films.
And the next film in the virtual screening room is the directorial debut from Shatara Michelle Ford, Test Pattern. It has been described as everything from a psychological horror film to a romantic comedy to realist drama and even a feminist nightmare. which is one of the ways that the director herself envisioned the project. Filmed and set in Austin, Texas, the movie starts as a romantic comedy of sorts, with a meet-cute between Renisha and Evan. Renisha is a highly educated Black woman working in development for nonprofits, and Evan is a white tattoo artist with ambitions of opening up his own shop. After a bit of a rough start between the two, they hit it off on their first date and sparks fly. After a few months, they're living together in an East Austin home, along with their 2 dogs and a cat. After Renisha's first day at her new job, her friend Amber implores her to go out to a bar. Of course, her first day on the job is a Monday night, and she's being dragged out on the town. Evan doesn't want to join, but she reluctantly goes and meets Amber up at a small dive bar. And after some political discussion in a fairly empty dive bar, a couple of guys offer them drinks, and they're pretty insistent about buying them those drinks. And this is when the film goes from being a romance to more of a psychological thriller. The night doesn't end well, especially not for Renisha, who arrives at Amber's house the next morning really shaken after waking up next to one of the men that propositioned them the night before. And as Renisha struggles to remember what happened, what exactly transpired that previous night, bits and pieces of the evening kind of flash in her head, and she's not really sure what's actually a memory and what she's piecing together or making up herself. But in that kind of hazy memory that she's in, while that's happening, Evan insists that they need to get to a hospital to have a rape kit administered, of course, fearing that she's been a victim of sexual assault. And as the couple bounce from hospital to hospital, trying desperately to navigate the woefully inadequate healthcare and justice systems that they're counting on to bring this waking nightmare to an end, the tone once again shifts into realist drama without any easy answers. Director Ford sets out to make a film that tackles a myriad of systemic issues in America today. After reading about the regulations, poor practices, and lack of resources for victims of assault, especially as it pertains to rape kits, she began the process of making the film we see here, Test Pattern. She wanted to explore issues around consent and race as well. And all of this is pointedly about an interracial couple and is told from the Black female perspective, living within the white supremacist patriarchy that can often be a frightening experience just in one's very own existence, just living your day-to-day life. Ford poured all of her resources into the film, working with her collaborators to make the film on a lean budget without compromises, sticking to a 21-day shoot to tell a nuanced and layered story for the Me Too era in a specific time and a very specific place of Austin, Texas. Like 17 Blocks, which I talked about just a little bit ago in the podcast, this film can be difficult to watch at times, but it's also a really important movie and a very well-crafted debut feature. And also, like 17 Blocks, there's a strong DC connection with the star Brittany S. Hall, who is a DC native born and raised. I hadn't seen Hall in any films up to this point, and for me, she's the major standout alongside the brilliant writer-director. As Renisha, she's given the task of carrying the whole film on her shoulders, and she delivers a really amazing performance that beautifully navigates the shifts in tone that we get throughout the film. And much of that is done through her face in a lot of silent scenes, a lot of long takes. The script itself is actually, I think, only about 30 pages. And for a almost 90-minute film, that's pretty short. They added some more dialogue throughout the process and rehearsals and things, but just goes to show that Hall here is doing a lot without saying a lot, without having actual words to convey the emotions that she's feeling. And both Hall and Ford are definitely ones to watch, but the supporting cast are also really strong here. But Test Pattern is very much a welcome discovery for me, and I hope our listeners take the chance to jump in early on a couple of rising stars with this great film.
Well, I Definitely want to see this film, Ben, and hearing you talk about it more is making me want to see it more, but it's also making me think a lot about Michaela Cole's series, I May Destroy You, which, seems like it tackles similar issues around consent and navigating, systemic injustices and inequities in the healthcare system and policing in the UK, of course, as opposed to the US. But I feel like there are a lot of points of similarity, and also in terms of tone, it sounds like it might be a little bit similar. Although Evan, the boyfriend in this film, sounds like he's a lot more helpful and supportive than Arabella's horrible Italian boyfriend in I May Destroy You. But other than that, I think maybe a good comparison. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great comparison, and one that we've talked about on the podcast. I May Destroy You, a really great series. I think this is kind of an American answer to that in a much more lower budget presentation, but done really well, even with limited resources in that regard. And I think Evan, you're right, he's definitely more helpful, but there's also an argument to be made that he's still not listening as well. And there's a lot of those kinds of subtle issues there that aren't explicit, but you can really tell that the filmmaker here, Ford, is trying to leave it open to interpretation in terms of how these characters are acting, and no one is necessarily a huge villain except for, of course, the perpetrator of the assault and the systems that are being critiqued. But the characters here are all pretty nuanced, which is a nice touch to the film as well. All right, so that is Test Pattern from our friends at Kino Lorber.
So next up is Twilight's Kiss, which is coming to us from Strand Releasing. And this is the second feature from Hong Kong director Ray Yung, who previously made 2015's multi-award winning Front Cover, and who is also, by the way, the executive director of the Hong Kong Lesbian and Gay Film Festival. So he's a very busy man. And like Front Cover, Twilight's Kiss centers on a gay romance. But unlike Front Cover, which is kind of a rom-com whose lead characters are two hip young men, a famous actor and a fashion stylist, Twilight's Kiss presents the less frequently addressed topic of a romance between two older characters. In this case, two closeted married men in their 60s and 70s, grappling with their identities and finding love in, as the title suggests, their twilight years. The two men are Pak, played by Tai Bo, veteran actor who you may have seen in Police Story, The Cabbie, City of Sadness. And Pak is a 70-year-old taxi driver who refuses to retire and is eagerly awaiting the birth of his latest grandchild. And then Hoi, played by Ben Yun, who also appears in 2046, which we have in our Wong Kar-wai series at the moment. And Hoi is a 65-year-old retired single father who is absolutely terrified that his devout Christian son will discover his identity as a gay man and disown him. And as these men meet by chance and strike up a conversation that eventually leads to a secret romance, director Ray Yung uses their relationship as a way to give both characters space to recount and recall their personal histories and struggles, and to potentially contemplate the idea of a future together beyond the restraints imposed by society and their large extended families. And this blossoming romance is set against the backdrop of the daily family dramas that each man is dealing with at home, and also against the backdrop of a group of older men who are out and who are taking part in a campaign to establish a gay nursing home so that they can spend their older years surrounded by people that understand them and without fear of having to once again hide their identities when they go into a nursing home. And director Ray Yung has said that he based this story on extensive oral histories of gay seniors living in Hong Kong that he had come across several years ago. And he said that with this film, he really wanted to shine a spotlight on this community, which even he, as a gay man from Hong Kong, was not really aware of until he read these oral histories. In fact, one of the leaders of the campaign to establish this nursing home in the film is played by a man who led a similar campaign in real life and who Jung had met as part of his research. And in fact, one of the speeches he gives in the film, and one of the film's most poignant and heartrending moments, is almost word for word a speech he actually gave in support of the real life campaign that he was part of. And I think perhaps because we perceive Hong Kong as relatively liberal with respect to LGBTQ rights, granted one with, a society with a long way to go, same-sex marriage is not currently recognized in Hong Kong. It might be easy to forget how hard it must be for people there who came of age while homosexuality was illegal. It's been decriminalized only since 1991 in Hong Kong, and who were consequently forced to remain closeted, and who now, despite the change in the law and in society at large, still find themselves kind of hemmed in by societal and familial expectations. I think this film really sensitively and empathetically depicts the dilemma facing these two characters, Pak and Hoi, and many other people like them, as they find themselves caught in almost an impossible situation. Twilight's Kiss won the Audience Award at the 2020 Asian American International Film Festival. It won the Best Actor prize for Tai Bo, who plays Pak, at the 2020 Hong Kong Film Awards, so kind of like the Hong Kong Oscars. And I also think it would make a great double feature with another multi-award-winning film anchored by two powerful performances that we currently have in the virtual screening room. Filippo Meneghetti's Two of Us, about two retired women who have shared this decades-long secret relationship, love affair. So yeah, I highly recommend this. It's very sensitively told, very nicely shot, and it's a great, as I mentioned, double feature suggestion incoming, double feature with Two of Us. So again, that's Twilight's Kiss, coming to us from Strand Releasing.
All right, so the final film we have opening in our virtual screening room this week is Demonlover. And this is a 2002 film from French director Olivier Assayas, who has been a cinematic trendsetter since the late 1980s. Assayas's eclectic filmography includes the edgy indie classics Irma Vep from 1996 and Clean from 2004, starring Hong Kong great Maggie Cheung, the period piece Les Destinées from 2000, and the wonderful family drama Summer Hours from 2008, the acclaimed prestige TV miniseries about 1970s international terrorism Carlos from 2010, and two of the best films Kristen Stewart has made in her young career, Clouds of Sils Maria from 2014 and Personal Shopper from 2016. Demonlover was a controversial effort back in 2002. A business world thriller among tech companies entirely willing to break the law to gain an advantage in what was then a highly profitable emerging market. Website-delivered niche pornography, including Japanese hentai or anime pornography, pop culture cosplay, and torture porn. The film went for a look and tone of clean corporate offices and hip and stylish executives making high-stakes deals to sell a rancid, toxic product, but one that's profitable. Connie Nielsen plays the ambitious young exec Dion, who supplants a senior executive early on through very extra-legal means, and whose ambitions to advance within her current company may actually be in service of that company's main business rival. So within the first few scenes, the film establishes that the corporate espionage taking place here is at the same level of rules breaking as that of government-sponsored espionage, at least from what the movies tell us. The cast includes Charles Berling as a senior exec Nielsen seems to have a love-hate relationship with, Chloe Sevigny as an exec assistant she appears to have a hate-hate relationship with, and Gina Gershon as a sharp but seedy American tech executive / porn peddler. And Gershon here has a bit of the nasty charisma she brought to late 90s thrillers like Showgirls, Bound, and Face Off in the late 90s. The early scenes in Demonlover are extremely effective at setting up the corporate world intrigue. Junkets to Tokyo to meet with anime studios and party, business class international flights, high-stakes business negotiations with frenemy business partners in pursuit of what was then the next big innovation, 3D, as well as executive suite office politics and messy personal lives. But midway through the film, on-screen events become more surreal and untrustworthy narratively, specifically regarding Connie Nielsen's character, following an attempt to pilfer sensitive information that goes horribly awry. The latter half of the movie includes scenes that may be a result of Nielsen's into-deep double game of corporate espionage and her exposure to liability among her fiercest rivals. Or it may represent a mental break and blurring of the line between lived reality and online fantasy worlds, which Nielsen is shown to have developed a strong craving, perhaps even a compulsion for. The film's early scene setting could play well as episodic television. The latter scenes begin to resemble David Lynch's Lost Highway or Mulholland Drive. Back in 2002, when it came out, Demonlover divided critics and audiences for its provocative content and mysterious narrative. I found it fascinating to revisit the film nearly 20 years later, now in a newly restored director's cut from Janus Films. While the tech in the film was bleeding edge and state-of-the-art for 2002, it's jarring to see so many flip phones and zero talk about social media. But then again, Assayas wasn't going for sci-fi, and how could he or anyone else know what was in store? However, I think as to pornographic and violent content and addiction modeling interaction for online users, he was sadly on point with emerging trends of internet culture and commerce that was coming into being. Demonlover is a very rated R, late night kind of movie, but I recommend it as a challenging and thought-provoking movie giving serious treatment to difficult subject matter. And also to see Connie Nielsen in a fierce performance, someone who I wish had had more good screen opportunities like this to show what she can do.
Well, Todd, this is one that I haven't seen, and I've actually seen all the films of Olivier Assayas that you mentioned. So I'm a pretty big fan of the director, and looking forward to catching this new restoration. And of course, as you mentioned, and we talked about earlier, it's a new director's cut.
Yeah, Ben, and I look forward to comparing notes after you've had a chance to see it for yourself. Being the fan of his film work that you are, I think you're going to find that this one does seem kind of like a missing link or missing chapter in the films he made in the 90s and 2000s. Not that I would say that it's a complete masterpiece or entirely successful in every regard, but there's just so much envelope pushing and so much that's vital about what he is trying to capture about what was going on in the tech world and where it was pushing towards, again, from that vantage point in 2002. And of course, it's well made and well acted, like all of his films are. But yeah, I think when you assess his filmography, this is one that really has to be reckoned with. All right, so once again, that's Demonlover, coming out in a new restoration and director's cut from Janus Films. Okay, so that's what's new this week in AFI Silver's virtual screening room. In addition to discussing the films we have available as virtual cinema, each week we also like to discuss some other ideas for films that you can view at home, this being our Programmer's Pick section. And today we're going to discuss a film released in 1931 during the very early days of the sound era, when the Hollywood studios were still very much figuring out the new medium. And this film's studio, Universal Pictures, was not yet considered one of the true majors within the industry. This film brought to the screen, not for the first time, but most iconically, perhaps the greatest of all monster characters in the history of horror, Count Dracula, from the 1897 novel by Bram Stoker. The 1931 Dracula was a massive, surprising hit, making a bankable star out of the heavily Hungarian-accented Bela Lugosi, even as it typecast him for life. And Dracula created a niche in horror films that Universal would thoroughly and creatively exploit for decades to come. Marking its 90th anniversary this month, we're going to talk about how this somewhat humble production became the worldwide pop culture phenomenon that it is still today, the cinematic touchstone for all vampire fiction across all media.
So yeah, while 1931's Dracula is indeed a genre-defining classic that kicked off an entire era and arguably an entire universe of horror filmmaking, It was certainly not the first film adaptation of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel. And that honor essentially goes to F.W. Murnau's unauthorized 1922 adaptation, Nosferatu, which we discussed at length on a previous podcast, by the way, if you feel like doing a podcast double feature, if that is even a thing. And then if you want to go back a little further, the character Dracula is also present in two lost silent films, although exactly how much they rely on the plot of Bram Stoker's novel is not entirely clear. And those are the 1920 Russian film Dracula with a K and the 1921 Hungarian film Dracula's Death. But regardless, it's generally agreed that Murnau's Nosferatu was the first true adaptation of the novel, which is ironic since shortly after the film's debut in 1922, Bram Stoker's estate filed suit claiming plagiarism and copyright infringement. The filmmakers thought they'd made just enough changes to the source material to avoid this, but the Bram Stoker estate prevailed, with Bram Stoker's widow petitioning the judge in the case to order all copies of Nosferatu to be destroyed, which he did. But fortunately for us, and fortunately for Universal Pictures and the team that made the 1931 Dracula adaptation, this effort was not successful, and Nosferatu cast this long shadow over the vampire genre. But unlike Nosferatu, Todd Browning's adaptation for Universal Pictures was authorized. In fact, it was the first authorized film adaptation of the material, the first American version of Dracula, and the first sound version produced in any country. And then here's the other wrinkle in the story of how it came to be. 1931's Dracula is not based directly on Bram Stoker's novel, but rather on American writer John L. Balderston's 1927 hit Broadway adaptation of the 1924 play adaptation by Irish playwright Hamilton Deane, both of which were authorized by the Stoker estate. So basically, 1931's Dracula was an adaptation of a Broadway adaptation of a stage play adaptation of the original novel. And in fact, Universal Pictures head of production at the time, Carl Laemmle Jr., son of the studio's owner, Carl Laemmle Sr., and pretty new on the job at that point, must have been pretty convinced that the box office potential was real here, because they ended up paying $40,000 for the rights to the novel and to both the stage plays to ensure that Universal would have the exclusive rights to this character. And this is in contrast to Carl Laemmle Sr., who apparently had said no to Todd Browning on multiple occasions when he'd asked to make a Dracula adaptation in the 1920s. So it was the young blood, pun intended, at Universal that saw the possibilities here, took a big risk, and with Dracula launched this highly successful and beloved series of monster and horror movies that would come to be seen as a golden era for the genre and for the studio. Universal had initially brought in Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Louis Bromfield to write the script and to kind of reconcile the novel version and the two play versions. Ultimately, he wasn't really able to do that. They then turned to screenwriter Garrett Fort, who also, by the way, wrote the screenplay for Universal's 1931 Frankenstein adaptation. And it was really the Broadway production that Fort leaned on the most in terms of his plotting and tone in his script. And since 1922's Nosferatu was deemed unauthorized and basically fair game, he also took a healthy dose of inspiration from that film without Universal even having to pay for it. So just as the original novel kind of took several existing stories and aspects of historical folklore, because yes, vampire lore obviously predates Dracula, this Todd Browning directed, Garrett Fort scripted, Carl Laemmle Jr. produced Dracula drew on various sources to create something that felt kind of entirely new and really created the image of Dracula that's persisted and pervades pop culture right to this day. This suave, sophisticated aristocrat, cloaked, pun intended, in an era of exoticism and bad boy charm, basically the opposite of Nosferatu's Count Orlok. And while, of course, credit goes to the filmmakers and to the elaborate set design and cinematography, which kind of cloaked Dracula in this air of alluring, shadowy mystery and emphasized his hypnotic gaze. This version of Dracula was really made iconic by the actor who played him in the 1927 Broadway adaptation and here in the 1931 film adaptation, the incomparable Bela Lugosi.
I am Dracula. I bid you welcome,
Yes, the legacy of Dracula cannot be overstated how much it's tied to this iconic performance by Bela Lugosi, who would go on to define this vampire and all others who portrayed him for decades to come. And as Todd mentioned, the performance would go on to define him as well, tying him to similar roles for the rest of his career. But before we explore the typecasting, I'll just give a brief bio on the Hungarian-American actor and activist. Bela Lugosi was born Bela Ferenc Desu Blasco in the city of Lugos in the Kingdom of Hungary in 1882. He was the youngest of 4 in a Roman Catholic family and dropped out of school at 12. Began his acting career on stage at the age of 20, performing in operettas and provincial theaters, and also took the name Lugosi around the same time in honor of his birthplace. After moving to Budapest in 1911, he was quite active in the National Theatre of Hungary until he enlisted as an infantryman with the Austro-Hungarian Army during World War I in 1914. And after his time in the army, he appeared in approximately a dozen silent films between 1917 and 1918 in Hungary before being exiled to Germany because of his leftist activism and involvement in founding the Hungarian Actors Studio. Much later, he would be one of the founding members of the Screen Actors Guild and serve on the union's advisory board there. Soon after his exile to Germany, he left for the U.S. and arrived in New Orleans in December of 1920, making his way up to New York and Ellis Island by March of 1921. And after putting together a small stock company of Hungarian expat actors and touring the East Coast performing for expat communities, he landed his first role in a Broadway play in 1922, The Red Poppy, although he could barely speak English at the time. But by 1927, after performing in several plays and some silent films, Lugosi was approached to star in the Broadway adaptation of Dracula, as we touched on already, which was wildly successful and critically heralded. He toured with the production and decided to stay in LA after the end of the run, which is the last stop on the run in 1928. And now on contract with Fox Film, he had some small roles in a couple of silent films as well as some early talkies, all the while maintaining his role as Dracula on stage and also lobbying to play him in the film adaptation. However, as a still relatively unknown actor at the time, Lugosi was not Universal's first choice for the role. Conrad Veidt, Paul Muni, John Ray, and a handful of other actors were considered before him. But of course, ultimately he landed the role in part because he agreed to take in just $500 a week for his performance. Of course, at this point, it's unimaginable to think of anyone else in this role, and he's pretty much perfect for it. And Variety agreed at the time. They wrote, "It is difficult to think of anybody who could quite manage the performance in the vampire part of Bela Lugosi, even to the faint flavor of foreign speech that fits so neatly." So at this point, Lugosi was a relatively seasoned actor, and of course, having played Dracula on stage for so long, he really had this role down to a science. His creepy and menacing performance that is undercut with moments of humor, but always maintains a commanding screen presence, is what makes the film so well known and has made it so enduring and classic and iconic for all these years. But of course, this would also lead to his typecasting throughout the rest of his career. For Universal, he played the horror villain in Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Raven, Son of Frankenstein, and he also starred in the independent White Zombie in 1932. This typecasting was also the start of not only his roles in these films and monster movies, but his working relationship with actor Boris Karloff, who made his name by playing another Universal movie monster, Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster, if you want to be pedantic, also in 1931. They worked on The Black Cat, The Raven, The Invisible Ray, Son of Frankenstein, Black Friday, and Gift of Gab for Universal, and a couple films for RKO, You'll Find Out in 1940, and The Body Snatcher all the way in 1945. But despite the size of the roles, in some cases Bela doing more work than Boris, really being the star, Boris was always billed before Bela. And that led to some conflicting reports, among other things, that the actors didn't really get along. But From most accounts, they actually did, and I guess it's just a story that sounds better if they're constantly butting heads and being pitted as rivals. But it looks like they were more amicable than that in reality. If you want to do a real deep dive on Bela and Boris, these great actors of the horror genre, I highly suggest checking out Karina Longworth's season of her top-notch podcast, You Must Remember This, from 2017, simply called Bela and Boris, where she goes much deeper than we can here, of course, given a whole season, but also just an insane amount of research that she does for her shows. It's a really cool season and gets you way deeper than what we can talk about for both these actors. By the late 1930s, Bela's career had been waning a bit, but a revival of Dracula and Frankenstein, played on a double bill by California theater owner Emil Ullman in August 1938, really boosted his popularity again and inspired Universal to re-release the films themselves. And this is also where Lugosi was cast as Igor in Son of Frankenstein in 1939. And in the same year, Lugosi would do a rare non-horror film playing Commissar Razinin in Ernst Lubitsch's Ninochka. But sadly, by the 40s, he developed an addiction to opiates, in particular morphine and methadone, which he was using to treat a severe chronic sciatica that was a result of injuries suffered during his military service. And of course, this limited his roles even further. But he was in Ghost of Frankenstein in 42, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman in 43, and in 48, he played Dracula for the second and last time in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And late in life, Lugosi would collaborate with director Ed Wood, who cast him as a narrator in Glen or Glenda in 1953, and also as a Frankenstein-like mad scientist in Bride of the Monster in 55. His last film appearance would actually be in an Ed Wood film as well, Plan 9 from Outer Space, which is mostly clips of him that were films they were working on together, Wood and Lugosi, that never came out. And so most of what you see is those clips and a lot of Ed Wood's wife's chiropractor standing in for Lugosi for Plan 9. And like his relationship with Boris Karloff, there's some conflicting reports about his relationship with Ed Wood. Lugosi's son, Bela Jr., was one who thought that Wood took advantage of his father in his old age. But again, most reports say that they were good friends. And although this meeting from Tim Burton's 1995 Ed Wood is apocryphal, it's not exactly how they met. They were introduced by a mutual friend. I think this clip with Martin Landau as Bela, for which he won a Best Supporting Actor Oscar, and Johnny Depp as Ed Wood, gives you a good idea of what the relationship might have been like and where Lugosi was at the time in his career.
Boy, Mr. Lugosi, you must lead such an exciting life. When is your next picture coming out?
I have no next picture.
You gotta be joking. A great star like you must have dozens of them lined up.
Back in the old days, yes. Now no one gives two fucks for Bela.
But you're a big star.
No more. I haven't worked in 40 years. This business, this town, it chews you up, then spits you out. I'm just an ex-boogeyman. Make it right.
And of course, Bela Lugosi could never really shake his association with Dracula, but he had a pretty interesting career in spite of it, or perhaps because of it, and the doors the role opened, even if they weren't always the ones he wanted. In the end, Bela was buried with his cape and left an undeniable mark on movie history.
Now, in addition to this film's famous star, also somewhat famously, the director of the 1931 version of Dracula was Todd Browning. And along with the other macabre titles in Browning's filmography, Dracula, this iconic film, is cited as evidence of Browning's genius within the horror genre. But the truth may be somewhat more complicated. Browning began his career in showbiz as a circus clown and later a vaudeville stage performer before moving to film directing during the teens of the silent era, just when pictures were really taking off as big business. And early on in his filmmaking career, Browning was paired with actor Lon Chaney, the legendary Man of a Thousand Faces, whom Browning would go on to direct in many pictures in various genres, Among them, several of Chaney's greatest horror titles, including The Unholy Three, The Unknown, and The Holy Grail of Lost Films, London After Midnight, which is notably also a vampire film of sorts. After Dracula in 1931, Browning would go on to direct the still unnerving today circus set horror film Freaks in 1932, as well as Mark of the Vampire in 1935, which is a sound remake of London After Midnight, and The Devil Doll in 1936, both with Lionel Barrymore, and the former also featuring Bela Lugosi. But none of these films holds a candle to the 1931 Dracula in terms of box office success. So it's only natural to talk about this film as among Browning's greatest achievements and draw connections between this and the other dark and moody masterpieces he's credited for directing. But many who have researched the making of Dracula cite multiple accounts from cast and crew that Browning was kind of checked out on this production and didn't really give it his all, as with his other efforts, and that in fact he delegated a lot of decision-making to cinematographer Karl Freund. Now, the German emigre Freund is of course a titan in film history, having photographed some of the greatest German silent films, including Fritz Lang's Metropolis, The Golem, F.W. Murnau's The Last Laugh, and Berlin, Symphony of a City, as well as pioneering a number of innovative mobile camera techniques. In America, Freund worked on all sorts of films as a cinematographer, and also occasionally directed, including the very next year for Universal, The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff, 1932, and a few years later, Mad Love, starring Peter Lorre for MGM. So it's interesting to think about how much the very talented Karl Freund might be a key contributor to the film Dracula ultimately came out to be.
And as I mentioned earlier, Dracula was quite a big gamble for Universal Pictures. Yes, they had dabbled in some monster-adjacent, horror-adjacent, and macabre films during the silent era, with films like The Hunchback of Notre Dame from 1923 and The Phantom of the Opera from 1925. But Dracula really represented their first kind of serious supernatural thriller, and their first, and arguably the first, horror film in the modern sense of the word of the sound era. And luckily for Universal, the gamble paid off, buoyed in large part by their very carefully orchestrated publicity campaign, which kind of prefigured what William Castle and Alfred Hitchcock would do in the ensuing decades with their horror releases, and relied on instilling fear and morbid curiosity in potential audiences with widely circulated stories of patrons passing out, overcome by the shock at the horror on the screen. And in fact, within 48 hours of its opening at New York's Roxy Theatre on February 12th, 1931, so 90 years ago from right now, Dracula had sold 50,000 tickets, building momentum that culminated in the film becoming Universal's most profitable release of 1931. And seeing the success of Dracula, Universal quickly followed it up in November 1931 with another very successful monster adaptation, which we've touched on a few times already, James Whale's Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff, again based on a stage adaptation of the original novel, which had itself been inspired by the success of the Dracula stage adaptation. And it was really with the success of Dracula and then Frankenstein coming in quick succession that Universal saw they had this winning formula and embarked on what would become the Universal Classic Monsters franchise over the next couple of decades. So here you have more than 75 years before the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Universal Pictures basically inventing the idea of a shared cinematic universe in which they created a stable of key characters, which then featured in sequels and spin-offs and crossover team-up titles known as Monster Mash or Monster Rally films, in which these famed monsters would appear together in a shared story. So Dracula and Frankenstein kicked off this run of Universal monster movies that debuted one after another of these iconic movie monsters, and they basically established the trademarks of a Universal monster movie, combining macabre, gothic settings with monsters that were often as kind of sad and pathetic as they were scary, and with stories that tapped into anxieties around death and insanity, and that also revealed both the fallibility and the heroism of ordinary humans in the face of such terror. So following Dracula and Frankenstein came The Mummy in 1932, also starring Boris Karloff and directed, as Todd mentioned, by Dracula cinematographer Karl Freund. Then came James Whale's 1933 version of H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man, starring Claude Rains. And then came the first and arguably best sequel of the series, 1935's The Bride of Frankenstein, also directed by James Whale, with Boris Karloff reprising his role as Frankenstein's monster. And then in 1941 came The Wolfman, directed by George Wagner and starring Lon Chaney Jr., by the way, son of Lon Chaney Sr., who had been Universal's first choice to play Dracula in the 1931 film, but he had sadly died. And also featuring appearances by Claude Rains and Bela Lugosi. The Wolfman was followed by 1943's Phantom of the Opera, again starring Claude Rains. And then arguably maybe the last introduction of a new Universal monster came in 1954 with Gillman in Jack Arnold's The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And throughout this period between the early 1930s and early 1950s, as I mentioned, Universal also put out numerous sequels and spin-offs and crossover films. The first Dracula sequel came in 1936, hot on the heels of the success of The Bride of Frankenstein, with Lambert Hillier's Dracula's Daughter, also scripted by Dracula screenwriter Garrett Fort, but notably not starring Bela Lugosi. A second sequel, Son of Dracula, came in 1942, starring Lon Chaney Jr. as Dracula. And then the count returned in 3 more Universal monster films of the mid-1940s, House of Frankenstein in 1944 and House of Dracula in 1945, both among the first Monster Mash or Monster Rally titles that I mentioned. And in both, John Carradine starred as Dracula. And then in the comedy, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein from 1948, which was the first in a series of Abbott and Costello Meet films, featuring the comedians getting into all sorts of antics with various classic Universal monsters. And although Lugosi played a vampire in 3 other movies during his career, besides the initial 1931 Dracula, Mark of the Vampire from 1935, The Return of the Vampire from 1943, and Mother Riley Meets the Vampire in 1952, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein actually marked the second and last time Bela Lugosi would appear as Dracula on screen, this time kind of exaggerating and satirizing his own iconic performance in the 1931 film. And so here he is as Dracula, posing as the suave Dr. Leos, pretending to meet Lou Costello's Wilbur Gray for the first time, when in fact he's already met him and hypnotized him in an earlier scene.
Sandra, I've just got to tell you, I was downstairs in the basement.
Basement? And what were you doing down there?
I opened the door.
He opened the door and fell down the stairs.
How careless. You should be careful. A person can get killed that way.
I hope you weren't disturbed, Dr. Leho.
It is perfectly right, my dear. Introduce me.
This is Miss Raymond, Mr. Young, and this is Wilbur.
Ah, Wilbur, why? I heard so much about you, I feel as if we have already met. And I must say, my dear, I approve very highly of your choice. What we need today is young blood and brains.
And then, interestingly, when Universal looked to reboot its classic monster universe with the Dark Universe in response to the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they went back to Dracula with 2014's Dracula Untold, and then continuing on with 2017's The Mummy, starring Tom Cruise, and 2020's smash hit The Invisible Man, starring Elizabeth Moss. And the franchise is set to continue with multiple future adaptations in various stages of development, including, reportedly, a new version of Dracula, which is going to be directed by Nomadland director Chloe Zhao.
And there's one more important entry in this Universal Monster universe, and it begins not after Dracula, but actually simultaneously, and I'll explain. I mentioned at the top that 1931 was the very, very early sound period in Hollywood. Until the end of the 1920s, silent films would be shipped to other countries and just switch out the intertitles for the local language, a relatively quick and inexpensive means to achieve international distribution. But now in sound, that wasn't an option. Early experiments to convert sound films into silent versions for the international market were quickly scrapped. And by 1931, the model of multi-language version productions was being experimented with. That is, a simultaneous production of the same project was filmed off hours on the same stage sets for a foreign language market, Spanish most popularly, but also German, French, and others. Thus, we have the other Dracula film from Universal in 1931, or if you prefer, Dracula from Universal Películas. This film was directed by George Melford. Like Todd Browning, a veteran of silent film direction, Melford's biggest title being 1921's The Sheik, starring Rudolph Valentino in a star-making role. But Melford did not speak Spanish himself, so he relied on a translator to verify what he was hearing and occasionally to communicate with his Spanish-speaking cast. This film starred Carlos Bellarius as Conde Dracula and Lupita Tovar as Eva Seward, the equivalent of Mina Harker from the original book. What's fascinating about this film, long thought lost and only properly restored in the 90s, is that it's quite good and entertaining, and it makes a fascinating companion to the English language original. And most notably, in the Spanish language version, there are 30 additional minutes of material, including many recognizable scenes from the original Stoker novel. As Dracula, Carlos Bellarius can't really compare to Lugosi and comes across more goofy than scary, but the rest of the cast is quite fun, with the Renfield and Van Helsing characters receiving notably more scene-chewing screen time here than in the Browning film. Also of note, the brides of Dracula and Dracula's new English victims, Lucy and Ava, are much more provocatively attired than in the Browning film, often in sexy low-cut negligees. So this film could be said to have more of a pre-code sauciness to it than the English language version. And also a note about star Lupita Tovar. She was a busy actress in both English and Spanish films during the 1930s, and she would go on to marry this film's producer, Paul Connor. And their daughter, Susan Connor, would become a screen actress in the 1950s, her best-known film being Imitation of Life from 1959. And their son, Paul Connor Jr., also would become a film director and producer. And Lupita Tovar's grandsons are filmmakers Chris and Paul Weitz, who, of course, have been very busy from the 90s onwards, having a big hit with American Pie, About a Boy, and then a variety of other films and series as writers and directors, either singly or collaboratively. And Lupita Tovar only just passed away in 2016. She lived to be 106.
Well, the Spanish language production was just the first of many, many ensuing versions of Dracula. And as I already mentioned, Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula really set the mold for this suave and sophisticated, alluring version of the Count that would continue to dominate in these subsequent cinematic adaptations, all the way from the first Hammer horror Dracula film, Terence Fisher's Horror of Dracula from 1958, starring a very gentlemanly and genteel Christopher Lee as Dracula, to 1979's Dracula, directed by John Badham and starring Frank Langella as an almost irresistible Count Dracula, to Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula, starring Gary Oldman as the epitome of cool 1890s meets 1990s vampire style, and then right up to the recent 2019 BBC miniseries starring Danish actor Claus Bang as a very gentlemanly, frankly quite hot Dracula. And I think there's no better way to sum up the enduring appeal of this type of Dracula that Bela Lugosi's performance initiated than by turning to Taika Waititi's 2014 vampire mockumentary, What We Do in the Shadows, and the vampire wisdom of Iago, Deacon, and Vladislav.
Yeah, some of our clothes are from victims. You might bite someone and then you think, ooh, those are some nice pants. Do with these.
Change it. When you're a vampire, you become very sexy. We are trying to attract victims to us.
Not sure about the waistcoat.
I go for a look which I call dead but delicious. We are the bait, but we are also the trap.
Hello, ladies. Voila, we are ready to go into town and party. Vampire style.
We're all big fans of what we do in the shadows here at the podcast. And I just want to add to Abby's list 2 other 70s era spoofy reinterpretations of the Dracula legend that still very much traded on the Bela template from the 1931 version of the suave aristocratic seducer. Those being the blaxploitation classic Blacula from 1972, starring William Marshall, and the disco-era spoof Love at First Bite from 1979, starring George Hamilton, a personal favorite of mine, which seemed to always be on cable television in the early to mid-1980s, and a film that I've watched many, many times.
Dracula in New York. His style is irresistible. His curiosity is irrepressible. And when he takes a bite out of the Big Apple, his appetite is insatiable.
If you're hungry, master, we could ring for the night maid.
And if we're talking about films that you've watched many times, especially at a younger age, we have to go to the full-on satirical, slapstick, jokey Dracula Dead and Loving It from director Mel Brooks, who also played Van Helsing in the film. And the film starred Leslie Nielsen as Dracula, doing his best to Bela Lugosi. It's a satirical adaptation of the story, which it borrows heavily from the 31 film, but also from the Hammer films that Abby mentioned, in terms of the look and the visuals. And this is Brooks's last film as director and was critically panned at the time. It's one of those movies that I'm afraid to revisit because I loved it as an 8-year-old, and all the over-the-top gore and blood that was played for laughs and the silly accents from Nielsen and Brooks and others. And like Spaceballs was my introduction to Star Wars. The first thing I saw of the Star Wars universe was Spaceballs, another Mel Brooks classic. This film, Dracula Dead and Loving It, was my introduction to the Dracula universe. Other than possibly one of the more iconic counts, and maybe the most iconic count for me, because it hit me at the right age, is the Count from Sesame Street.
Greetings, I am the Count.
Hi, Count.
Do you know why they call me the Count? Because I love to count things.
I know.
Ah, look. Blocks. I will count them.
Oh, wait. Those are my friend Ernie's blocks, and he
Silence.
told me...
I am counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. No, I counted that one before. It is difficult to count these blocks in a pile.
Too bad, but you see, Ernie said...
I know what I will do. I will move each block as I count it.
Oh, no. Ernie asked
Silence.
me to...
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 blocks! Yes! Thank you very much.
And speaking of other 1970s counts, let's not forget Count Gore Duvall, local Washington, D.C. horror host extraordinaire, who was making his own television appearances in the 70s with his show Creature Feature that ran well into the 80s. And for locals to the Washington, D.C. Silver Spring area, you may have come out for one or many of the sold-out shows that we've done with Count Gore at the Silver, when he's presented various horror films throughout the years, including a double bill of Frankenstein and Dracula.
Greetings, I am the Count Gore Duvall, and welcome to my special
AFI presentation of The Horror of Dracula.
So, beyond all of the filmic versions of Count Dracula indebted to Bela Lugosi's iconic original, and the spoof versions, and the kids' TV versions, and cartoon versions, and the official and unofficial commercial products, everything from Count Chocula breakfast cereal to decades worth of Halloween costumes, this 90-year-old film has entered a place in the pop culture canon that very few films ever do, alongside the Star Wars and Marvel Comics and Harry Potter franchises. So if you haven't seen the 1931 version of Dracula in a long time, consider revisiting it. And if you've never seen it, you have no excuse. You really need to check out this important piece of film history.
And we'll leave you with one last Bela Lugosi clip from the great Dracula from 1931.
Listen to them, children of the night. What music they make.
Okay, that wraps it up for this week's edition of Silver Streams. Thank you all for listening. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and we hope that you see something that you love this week.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thanks as always for listening to another episode of Silver Streams, and we will see you next time.
A reminder to our listeners, you can find everything currently available in our virtual screening room on our website at afi.com/silver, and a portion of the proceeds from screening these titles at home goes to support AFI Silver Theater. If you have any feedback or questions, you can email us at silverinfo@afi.com.
You can get in touch with us or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at AFI Silver Theatre, and on Twitter at AFI Silver.
And music for this episode was provided by Blue Dot Sessions. Find more of their work on their website, sessions.blue.
White on white, translucent black capes, back on the ground. Bela Lugosi's dead. The bats have left the bell tower. The victims have been bled, red velvet lines.